Greetings and salutations, everybody. I'm Ivan Francis Wellbanks, and I'm back for yet another episode of Cutting the Strings. And I apologize if I sound under the weather today. I have been hit with that bug that you get at the end of the year, where you start coughing and you just like, okay, I don't know what this is, but I'm trying to stay real cool about it. Thankfully, I know that it's not certain things. We can't say on YouTube, but one thing I can tell you is that I'm taking my coffee, I'm taking my tea, and I'm taking my time to feel better. Um, yeah. So before I really jump into it, it's been a couple of months. I haven't really posted anything because I've had a lot of things going on personally and professionally. And I still got a couple of things going on, but I had a moment to take a deep breath and take a break away from everything. And just got back from going to Europe for 6 days, which was a great time. And coming back from Europe, had a change of ideology and thought around a lot of different things regarding my own personal life, which, I'll reveal in due time. But with that being said, I come back to you with a special edition episode because in the course of me being in Paris, I was actually just taking time just to see the sights and talk to people and just kind of exist and live life in my own little bubble. And it allowed me the time to actually write something interesting. I actually wrote an essay. And the title of the essay is It's Time to Clarify the Record on Masc4Masc. So this essay is going to be talking about masculinity versus femininity. But what I decided is that rather than taking an approach which is anecdotal, I was going to take a more research-based approach because as a feminine presenting gay man, I have often been told by people who are my associates and even some of my friends that when I address this topic, that because of the fact that I'm feminine presenting, my emotional leaning is going to show up very strongly. And so, in light of trying to ensure that emotion doesn't drive this conversation, I made sure to write out all of my thoughts and then present factual evidence based on studies and based on empirical studies that help to support what I'm discussing. So, one thing I will say is that people say facts are not feelings, and you know what? That is correct. Facts are not feelings, and feelings may not be facts. But what that is, there's something to be said about feelings. And as a feelings, there's information. Feelings are often developed and they're often present to demonstrate that there is an opinion attached to the fact in question. And so, with that being said, my opinions I'm going to keep pretty even keeled until the end. Because again, I want to lay the foundation for the discussion and have it in a way where I'm not jumping to emotion and appealing to emotion immediately, right? I don't need everybody to see me. And as far as I'm concerned, as far as my own personal stories, I've shared my personal stories enough times. So I don't really need to rehash them in this episode. But if you do want to have questions, or if you want me to make a separate video about my experience as a feminine presenting gay black man, then I will gladly do so. But for the purpose of this episode, I'm only going to be talking about masculinity versus femininity in more of an empirical, research-based context, and then talking about it really from the space of really setting some standard terms in motion so that when we have the discussion, we actually know what we're talking about. Because I sometimes feel like when we listen to other commentators talk about it, and again, it's no shade to them, we're talking about it from their own definitional standpoint. And I think that sometimes what we need to work with is a more standardized definition of what things actually mean. Because not everybody really knows exactly what masculinity means. Some people have their own belief as to what it means based off of their own experiences. But I want to come at it with a little bit more of a standardized lens. So that way, when we're having the discussion, we all know what we're talking about. So without further ado, let's get into it. It's time to clarify the record on Masc4Masc. Masc4Masc. No fats, no femmes. Real men only. Mask only. No pretenders. These are the types of phrases that often appear on profiles of millions of users on apps like Grindr, Sniffies, Jacked, and countless others. And the standard explanation for the use of these phrases is that they're statements of preference. These phrases clarify that the man in question is seeking something or someone masculine, and there's a need to weed out any and all of those who do not meet that metric. But then there's a series of questions that do arise when we start to engage with some of the phraseology. What is masculinity? Why is there such a demonstration for this preference? Does a privilege exist? And lastly, what is the impact of having both privileges and preferences exist at the same time on socializing and dating? Well, I think before we actually get into the main core of the subject, why don't we just try to lay out some clearly defined terms so that it helps frame our discussion today? So, what is masculinity? So, before we really jump into it, I want to first start with a standard dictionary definition, something that's neutral that all of us can probably agree on. Now, the word masculinity comes from the French word masculinité, or the root masculin, which describes the quality of something taking on the male form. And the first recorded use of the word in the English language took place sometime in the 1570s. The French also adapted this word from the Latin, masculinus, and an older version of the word masculus was also coming from Latin. These words mean male or masculine gender, or male, masculine, or worthy of a man, respectively. Often, the older versions of the word were just simply shortened to mas or mas, and the suffix idity refers to the state of the item being described, hence masculinity. Now, according to Merriam-Webster, masculinity is defined as the quality or nature of the male sex, the quality, state, or degree of being masculine or manly. Similarly, Oxford Learner's Dictionary states and defines masculinity as having the qualities or appearance considered to be typical of men, connected with or like. Now, there are other definitions that do provide a little bit more nuance. First and foremost, we have the Council of Europe. And the Council of Europe describes masculinity as those behaviors, languages, and practices existing in specific cultural and organizational locations which are commonly associated with men, thus culturally defined as not feminine. Sociology then provides us an even further comprehensive definition, which fully encapsulates what masculinity may actually be. In the essay or article Perceptions and Interpretation of Contemporary Masculinities in Western Culture, a systematic review, the article states that orthodox masculinity is mostly considered to be hegemonic and is evidenced by the dominance of men over women and other less powerful men. Traditional masculinity norms socialize men to project strength and dominance, particularly over others, and inherent restrictive stereotypes require men to be stoic, independent, tough, and powerful. Now, by using all of the definitions and building blocks on top of one another, the concept of masculinity begins to create a clear and common framework. And based on the above definitions in the articles and their findings, we include but are not limited to the following: that masculine is associated with a group of behaviors that indicate alignment with maleness and manhood, that masculinity exists as a part of social and societal organizational structures, that masculinity is based on a rigid context of manhood, thus impacted by societal expectations to be strong and virile, and that masculinity is tied to dominance, and that subordination does not allow for masculinity to exist. That said, it is understood that masculinity is what allows people in the modern world to more simply and quickly determine what a man is or what a man should be in relation to others, and what a man should be without having to engage in the mental gymnastics or take a collegiate level course to understand really what manhood is. From the available scholarly research, masculinity is not only used to identify males based on just biological sex. It goes a little bit deeper than that. It is used to define men socially and also used to differentiate them from females, as well as to set the terms and conditions of social engagement in the broader world that we interact with. Now, when we're talking about the rules of engagement, we also have to talk about exactly what those rules of engagement are and exactly how does masculinity impact those rules of engagement. The one way that I wanted to discuss this is talking about privilege. And as mentioned in the above article that I just talked about, masculinity can provide social privileges not found with femininity due to the social privilege being provided based on biological sex. Male privilege unequivocally exists. It's been scientifically understood and documented in interdisciplinary contexts for a while now. Both anthropological, sociological, medical, and even legal writings for the last 30 years have documented the phenomena in one facet or another. And quite frankly, male privilege exists. There's no way to say that it doesn't exist. It continues to contribute to disparities in income and employment, access to healthcare, and access to education worldwide. And however, these privileges are completely different and apart from masculine privilege. And let me just explain. Aside from mere semantics, masculine privilege is different than male privilege. Masculine privilege, or rather, male privilege, is based solely on sex. Male privilege is based solely on sex. But this presupposes also that all males are able to experience the privilege the same exact way. So the conundrum then arises when you begin to discuss men that may not necessarily adhere to the standards that men have set, right? You may meet a man who's biologically male, but they do not meet the standards of society set for them to be considered masculine. That is the secondary layer of how masculine privilege can exist separate from male privilege. After doing my own research and combing through dozens of articles from the 1990s up to 2025, the thing is interesting is that I have not actually found a straightforward definition of what masculine privilege is as opposed to what male privilege is. And partly it's because of the fact that the two are used interchangeably sometimes in the scholarship. However, this approach doesn't take into consideration when one who is a male doesn't engage with actions to, again, meet those social standards of manhood. Drawing from anecdotal evidence, this flattening of masculinity and maleness into one and the same doesn't take into consideration men who have a more flamboyant sense of fashion, or they don't favor sports and have no sports affinity, or even as far as, their voices and having a voice that may not necessarily have the amount of bass that is found and characteristic of a more masculine voice. It doesn't presuppose those things. And so it warrants the creation of a separate definition that is simplistic and pretty easy to follow, which is part of the reason why I propose and I offer that masculine privilege should be defined specifically as a system of social benefits provided due to a man's adherence to social norms that define manhood. Or I'll just use a more comprehensive version of that, is that masculine privilege really should be a system of social acceptance, benefits, and legitimacy conditioned upon a man's ability to adhere to community, social standards, and expectations with respect to conduct and physical presentation in line with what is expected of a man. This definition is developed to maintain the separation between maleness itself and the series of expectations and standards that also come with it. This definition also was developed to make it clear that maleness alone does not confer the social benefits all the time of just merely being male. And how men perform and act in alignment with those expectations is determinant of their social placement. Stated differently, the reason why I offer both definitions is to make that point that a man's social status, whether or not they could be relegated to being less than a man or even subordinated to a second class status, is based whether or not that man can meet the social expectations and obligations without variation. As mentioned above, the studies have shown that what manhood is defined by a very narrow and limited set of social rules and expectations. And now, at this point, I'll walk through a little bit more select articles that kind of explain this in more detail with a little bit more data and backing so that we can kind of get a better and clearer picture. Now, let's get into the empirical evidence and the science part of it. So, the science of masculinity and the gay men's preference for masculinity. Um, Due to manhood being so narrowly defined by many cultures, it makes it sense to just reason it that masculinity is based on a series of traits and characteristics and social expectations and mores and so on. In American culture, it is expected that a man have a deep voice and be physically larger than their female counterparts, that they are emotionally stoic, seemingly nearly stone faced, and that they have an affinity or knowledge of sports and more physical activity. However, a lot of men also learn what masculinity is based on what actions do not align with respect to their expectations. Because remember, some of it regarding what masculinity is based on what femininity is. So there's a comparative movement that happens there as well. Now, in the article, Masculine Self-Presentation and Distancing from Femininity in Gay Men, an experimental examination of the role of masculinity threat, which was published in 2015, researchers noted that some interesting findings were present. So first, the researchers noted in this particular study that although moderate size effects demonstrated that gay men who received a threat to their masculinity reporting more similar to masculine gay men and reported less desire to interact with feminine gay men than those whose masculinity was affirmed. The predicted results of lower liking of and greater discomfort with feminine gay men following a masculinity threat were not found. The significant findings are consistent with work that shows majority heterosexual male samples rejecting feminine gay men and engaging in hypermasculine behavior, essentially to try to shield themselves from the femininity. Further research showed that it provides that there are partial experimental evidence that links a preference for masculine behavior in the rejection of feminine gay men to threats to gay men's masculinity. In this, the research highlights how gay men, despite the persisting stereotype that they are not masculine, still experience pressure to conform to the majority group's values regarding gender norms and when their masculinity is threatened. Another article in Masculinity Threat Increases Bias and Negative Emotions Towards Feminine Gay Men, published by Wellman in 2021, they note that gender norms are the reason why preference exists for masculine men. And even amid gay men have adopted the general societal models for gender performance, and with it, expectations of how men are supposed to act. For gay men, the path is extremely narrow, primarily because although men and women both ascribe characteristics based on gender, men are expected to adhere to gender norms to a greater extent than women. This preference, however, is not merely a social preference. It also has implications for employment and business endeavors. In Gay and Straight Men Prefer Masculine Presenting Gay Men for a High Stakes Role, Evidence from an Ecologically Valid Experiment, published by Girard et al. In 2022. In this study, the researchers had a feminine presenting gay man and a masculine presenting gay man present a tourism campaign to a series of subjects. And Girard stated that, in short, the participants demonstrated a greater preference to cast masculine presenting over feminine presenting actors as representatives in the tourism campaign. It's also stated that this preference was significant amongst gay men at a rate no different than heterosexual men, and that this was in line with their initial hypothesis, indicating less favor for the feminine presenting gay man if presented as a representative. It is noted that stronger levels of anti-gay attitudes predicted a stronger preference for masculine presenting actors amongst heterosexual men. Thus, the study came to conclude in part that the observed preference for a masculine presenting actor supports the proposition that masculinity remains an advantageous characteristic in the pursuit of high status opportunities. Now, moving away from the employment and then from the business aspect of things, this also bleeds over into dating and sexuality. In dating, this preference remains consistent based on research findings. In Taking Off the Mask, How Gay Identifying Men Perceive and Navigate Hypermasculinity and Masking Culture Online, published by Granath in 2021. The study included 21 interviewees who were asked about their experiences dating online and using apps and profiles. Granath noted that there was a high value placed on traditional hegemonic masculinity in the stigmatization of femininity and the desire for the traditional straight acting gay man. Later in the article, Granath notes that the men who I interviewed overwhelmingly expressed that hypermasculine and straight acting men are glorified within gay spaces online, and furthermore, that deliberately making oneself appear more masculine online was a common practice. Granath also cites other studies indicating that the masculine preference of gay men is closely intertwined with aligning one's presentation to a standard heterosexual man's framework. In short, for men who identify as homosexual or bisexual, there appears to be scientific evidence rather than merely anecdotal evidence that shows that acting close to the heterosexual standard is preferred and actually carries benefits. Next, we will then also analyze now what the real life implications of these studies actually mean. So, what are the real life implications of this? Well, the science is full and replete with many examples of masculine preference existing. It is clear that when a feminine presenting man, such as myself, provides our anecdotes, however, about some of the treatment that we have received, we often are told that we are being emotional, hypochondriacs, melodramatic, we can't take rejection well, etc., etc., etc. But this is not necessarily be talking from a place of anecdote, however. This is talking from a place of after reviewing almost 20 years plus of scientific data that reference this particular issue. So for feminine presenting gay men are subject to a social tax of not just being gay and violating the sexual norms of the heterosexual world, but we also take on the societal tax of being feminine and violating the mores of being masculine in a world where we're supposed to be. In effect, we get penalized twice. So what comes with that is the sense of being relegated to a subordinate status. Thus, amongst gay men, the ideology becomes that by virtue of not adhering strictly to these actions and the way how to dress, speech patterns, and even the tone of voice of how a man should sound, we have effectively traded away all of our manhood or maleness, essentially. Or put differently, and in other words, feminine men get treated more like an it, not worthy of respect as men in the eyes of other men who can meet those expectations of how to walk, how to talk, and how to dress masculine, right? From my own experience, I've even heard men argue that to be feminine presenting willfully is trading away your manhood, and that language alone shows that feminine men are not respected, and that it seems to be a dishonor attached to turning away from traditional expressions of maleness and manhood to pursue a more nuanced and potentially more genuine version of self-expression. Now, masculinity also has a strong role in impacting dating for gay and bisexual men, as mentioned before. And a common discourse found in the gay community and bisexual community is this notion of preference. And I'll explain why I'm putting quotes around the word preference later on in the essay. But long story short, it is true that every human on earth who engages in sex or wants companionship has a preference, right? They have a preference for height, weight, items of physical appearance, hair color, even culture, religion. You name it, there may be a preference attached for it, and it's individualized from person to person, with there being over 8 billion people on planet Earth. So when you meet with another man who says they're Masc4Masc, or they insist on masc only, they indicate that it's their preference, while indicating that it is wrong to suggest that they change their preference or that they be open-minded to anything else aside from being masculine, right? And after speaking with hundreds of masculine presenting men from the time that I've been 18 to now being 32, or just saying over the years, or having spirited discussions or discourse about it, and also having lived and visited many different places, whether it be here in the States, in Atlanta, or New York, or Washington, D.C., L.A., Chicago, and even traveled internationally between London and Paris multiple times. And having these conversations, it seems to be that the common argument is that they cannot be made to be with a man who wants to emulate a woman or is not acting like a man, and that they're not attracted to them. So you can't force someone to be attracted to someone that you cannot be attracted to. And the assessment is fair in theory. I get that you can't force someone to be attracted to someone they're not attracted to. But in practice, this becomes a bit of a different matter because it's not just about necessarily attraction and necessarily who's pursuing who. It's a matter of also how people interact with one another beyond the initial, hey, how you doing text message, if that makes any sense. In practice, masculine men tend to take the presence of femininity in men as a sense of danger to their own masculinity, which is why, as evidenced in the previous studies, masculine men want to avoid aligning themselves with feminine men because there isn't a guilt by association. By extension, it also makes sense to reason that there is a perception that if they find themselves in close proximity with feminine men, they face potentially losing their own privilege in the eyes of the heterosexual men or gay masculine presenting men that already do have that masculine privilege attached to them. Based on this, rejections of feminine men tend not to merely just be based on incompatibility, but sometimes it's rooted in a place of disgust, which is why you get some of the inflammatory language above and beyond just the mere statement of rejection. In addition to that, we also have people who, from my own experiences, when I have presented masculine, when I've used a deeper tone of voice, or I've worn neutral color clothing, I've, refrained from wearing nails, and, engage in less flamboyant actions such as not using my hands to talk. I'm being very just neutral. Rejections tended to be a lot shorter. They tended to be just very straightforward, like, yeah, not a match, right? And not fraught with the harshness of abusive language. It's often as simple as, no, man, I'm good. Conversely, however, when I've presented as feminine, and when I also look at my other friends who are feminine presenting as well, whether it be online or in person, the rejections tend to be colored with a bit of a nastier tone. And so it's provided with a tone of disgust, and there is sometimes outright abusive language being used. Some have even gone on to suggest that, I'm either confused about how I wish to present, or I'm transgender, which, again, shout out to the trans community, because y'all guys are amazing. Y'all ladies are amazing. All of you are amazing. And just shout out to y'all for doing y'all thing and existing out here, because it is not easy. And continue to break the dichotomy in a world that the dichotomy doesn't really even exist to begin with. With that being said, it's not as simple as, hey man, I'm good, when you're dealing with a feminine presenting guy. Sometimes you will use language or hear language that is a lot more abusive to feminine presenting gay men because of that disgust. And some of it, again, could be rooted in, a fact that they don't want to be associated. And so it's like, ill, get away from me. Or there is a deep rooted self-hatred that presents itself by hostile treatment of other people. In other words, hurt people hurting other people. And so this violent reaction is in the name of defending preference, right? But is it really defending preference, or is it something else? And so now it's time for us to get into the semantics of what actually is a preference, as opposed to the term requirement. And I think that that's something that we should examine more closely. So I think that it's important, again, that when we're having this discussion, we're laying a foundation based on neutral definitions. So what is a preference and what is a requirement? And so I want to kind of lay the groundwork for what those definitions are first, before I explain in more detail what that actually means and those implications of those two terms. So again, we go back to the dictionary. And due to the fact that the term preference is used so much when gay men talk about demanding that they want to date only masculine men, who don't have a single inkling of femininity attached to them, we need to address what the term preference really means. So the term preference comes from the Middle English préférence, which was first recorded in the 1500s. The word is a carryover from the Middle French préférence, which came from the medieval Latin term preferentia, and the Latin verb root preferent or preferens, which is the present participle of prefer. So according to Oxford Learner's Dictionary, preference means a greater interest in or desire for somebody or something than somebody or something else. Merriam-Webster provides multiple different definitions for the word preference, but for our relevant usage today, it is for the act, fact, or principle of giving advantages to some over others. Now, in both definitions, it is indicated that there are multiple potential options or possibilities, but that is based on the proclivities of each person, and that they're more likely to choose one over the others based off of their own proclivity. So, for instance, when I travel to Europe, I prefer to use public transportation. Notice how my preference, however, does not exclude other modes of transportation, such as walking, using an Uber or a Lyft, a taxi, or, even renting a private car, right? All options remain, but taking public transportation is the one that tops my list, and it's the one that's most likely for me to use, right? So that is what a preference is. Now, when someone says, however, that there are no options and that they must adhere to a standard of manhood or masculinity for them to be taken seriously or seen as legitimate as a partner, even as just a person, it is akin to saying that someone must not do something or must be over 6 feet tall, right? It is a statement of a must or a must not. And so when it's posed this way, it's explicitly excluding anything that doesn't fit in the class or the category. So from a standpoint of logic and from a standpoint of understanding language, the term must is different than the term may. When I went to law school, we were taught that very clearly, that the term must and may are different from one another. And so there's a reason why those words exist differently and are distinct from one another, and they mean two different things. So that brings me to when someone says that there are no options and that they must adhere to a standard of manhood and masculinity for them to be taken seriously, it is essentially a requirement, right? And a requirement is different than a preference. So to break this down further, the word requirement is a modification, or it's an extension of the word required, which was first used in the English language in the 1660s. Per Merriam-Webster, requirement basically means stipulated as necessary to be done, made, or provided, or something essential to the existence or occurrence of something else. It is basically using that same example that I mentioned above. If I say that I require that someone not smoke, or I require someone to have graduated from college, those are absolute. Those are not subject to any variations. They're not subject to any other terms and conditions. There's no other viable or accepted options. Those are the options. And if those conditions are not met, then there's no opportunity for a connection to happen because the condition has not been met. So, based on just using the basic linguistic analysis and understanding the language for what it says, most Masc4Masc men don't really have preferences. They have requirements, not preferences, okay? So since there's a liberal use of the term preference, it could be seen that at best, that when they say, oh, I have a preference, right? And they're screaming that there's a term preference. I have a preference. My preference is for masc men only, right? It's really not a preference. It is really a lazy use of the word preference at best, to basically try to soften the blow when it's just really you have a requirement. And so I think that when people, masc men specifically, say this is it, I think that it's a matter of no. You should say that you have a requirement that a man is appearing masculine. It's not a preference. And at worst, a lot of gay men who decry femininity and they insist solely on all men being masculine, they need to stop using the term preference, because to me, and again, this is not necessarily coming from a place of emotion, but just as someone who is analyzing the language and analyzing what I see, it's intellectually a cop-out. Because you're not using the right terminology to describe what you're looking for. And, as I've been told before, if you're dating in the gay world, you have to be assertive. And using language that is not clearly definitive of what you want is a cop-out. So if you want to say that it is something that you require, it's a requirement. There's no way to walk around that. So with that being the case, I will just say that, we just need to be very clear that when we talk about it and say that femininity is, necessarily a problem, and Masc4Masc men say that, it's a preference, a lot of the times when we hear that it's a preference, we often use the term preference to try to smooth over the fact that there was other language that was used that wasn't necessary. And that sometimes what happens, they use the term preference to act as a cop-out to qualify how they mistreat and talk down to feminine presenting men, which isn't called for. And so that is a phenomenon I often notice, that when you do have that sort of discourse going on and you call out that, no, that's a requirement, a lot of times they say, okay, well, whatever you say, right? It's kind of like, that same like shrug of the shoulder, like, okay, what I said, but it really doesn't engage with the actual truth of the matter asserted. And I think that that's something that a lot of Masc4Masc men, again, you can have your requirement. It's nothing wrong with that. You can have your proclivity, nothing wrong with that. But when it comes to forwarding your proclivity or what you want at the expense of another group of people, and you are disrespectful to other groups of people, it no longer is a matter of you wanting your preference. It's a matter of you using the term preference as a cop-out to basically avoid taking responsibility and accountability for how you talk to people and using language. I think that that's essentially, my take on it. But again, this is just my opinion, in addition to providing all the other information and studies and articles that I've just presented to you. So in conclusion, At the end of the day, this essay should not be taken as an emotional plea for acceptance. Quite frankly, I take the position that facts will always outweigh emotions. Emotions are information, which is why this essay is so heavily sourced. And that's why I wanted to reference studies because, again, I don't want to come up here and say, as the angry feminine guy, oh, pick me, right? That's not what this is about. This is more so highlighting the truth of the matter for what it is and really explaining it in a way where it is very even keeled. Because again, I'm not trying to appeal to emotion here. I'm just saying it more as a FYI and just so you know that science has also acknowledged the phenomenon for what's been going on for a very long time now. And this is not a novel thing as to what some people may claim. So when you see other YouTubers like Say So TV or, Don Quell Dante, which have did great jobs in discussing the topics, when you listen to them discuss it, it's not like, oh, this is a novel thing. This has been talked about since the late 90s, and there have been articles going on discussing this for a long time. You can go on Google Scholar and look up, gay men, masculine privilege, and type in those words, and you can literally find some of the same articles that I've located. And there are also other articles that are beyond Google Scholar, like on Hein Online and a lot of other scholarly sources. So even out of the emotional talks of it, there's a lot of scientific evidence. And at this point, masculine preference does exist. And it doesn't really, masculine preference exists, masculine privilege also exists. And to say that it doesn't exist is basically just merely ignoring science at this point. But what this also says, I think it's also something important to realize that the importance of this essay is also to lay bare something that many masculine presenting men say is not real, or that, feminine presenting men say that we're coming with just the dramatics again. Oh my God, you're being emotional. Again, masculine presenting men live in a place of privilege. And so, as Sharia Krishnan said in her article, Blindness, Privilege, Blindness, and its Repercussions, and I'll source that as well, she's quoted to say that privilege is characteristically invisible to people who those that have it. People in dominant groups often believe that they have earned the privileges that they enjoy, or that everyone could have access to these privileges if they worked to earn them. In fact, privileges are unearned, and they are granted to people in dominant groups whether they want those privileges or not, and regardless of their stated intent. This same also applies to masculine men. Now, feminine gay men are often advised to do the work and to mask up. And speaking from my own experience, I recall going to speech pathologists while I was in college to try to fix my lack of bass in my voice. Or more drastically, I had an associate go through my closet and throw away pieces of clothing that were considered feminine in the hope that I could, make my wardrobe more masculine, right? And I would be presentable enough. And I had to come to learn that no amount of vocal coaching or throwing out my clothing could really change what was there. No amount of me wearing forces or Timbs or fitted hats or relaxed fit jeans or, even, changing how I walk by putting rocks in my shoes could change my feminine presentation. And years later, I now warn that the notion of feminine gay men needing to fix themselves is really destructive and almost in a way self-hating and self-deprecating. I can attest from my own experience and even having to engage with therapy years later that it was a soul-crushing experience and can ruin someone's dating life and sex life and their sense of self-confidence. And for most masculine gay men, studies show that because they do meet that societal ideal, they have a privilege by not having to do all the extra work. They just, by mere function of existence, exist. They don't have to second guess how they dress when they walk out the door or question their safety, walking around in the street because of how they show up. They don't have to hear the narratives that their natural disposition is the reason why their lives were so bad or why they were treated so poorly. Masculine gay men don't have to experience some of the heckling and disrespectful rejection and the use of inflammatory terms such as flamer or bati boy or all sorts of other manner of nasty things in conversation. Most masculine gay men have a privilege of flying under the radar in the street, and they can walk indistinguishably down the street to that of a heterosexual man. But feminine men, by contrast, don't have that level of safety. And sometimes with that lack of safety, it can really mean a matter of life or death in some particular instances. The research also shows that the masculine men possess privilege with regard to having their voice heard in business and regular social interactions, rather than being seen negatively or written off like how their feminine gay male counterparts are treated. So, for instance, as I noted earlier in the study about the high status opportunity and how there was a tourism campaign, and the masculine presenting gay man was actually given a better perception and reception from those who were listening in comparison to the feminine gay man. Again, highlighting that there is a business impact to this as well. And this bleeds into so many parts of our regular social lives that we don't even really want to talk about it, or rather, a lot of people don't talk about it, because if they did, they would really show how deeply ingrained it is that there is definitely a disparity that exists. So, when many Masc4Masc men retort that, oh, I can't have my preference, again, there's nothing wrong with having your preference, or requirements for that matter. But I think it would be wise to follow the advice of Toni Braxton, where she says, just be a man about it. Say that you require that your partners be masculine rather than you say you prefer it. If you say you prefer your partner to be masculine, then it means that, again, you prefer it, that would be best, but you would allow for your partner to not be masculine. If it's no potential waiver to that, or there's no allowable variation, you don't prefer your partner to be masculine, you require it. So stand 10 toes down in exactly what you require, and stop using the cop-out language of saying that you prefer it. Also, if you know that it's a non-negotiable, again, you should stick with the term requirement, because again, the term requirement is very clear. Most people with at least a 5th grade education know what the term required means. So if you're using the term required, then it's very clear that, okay, he's not checking for me, I can move on to someone else, and nobody's time gets wasted. So with that being said, in the event that you encounter someone who isn't your preference, I also would say for masculine, I think it's really not necessary to reduce their dignity. If someone has approached you and you don't find them attractive, say, nah, man, it's not a match, and you move on. That's all you really got to do. There's no reason to come up with any nasty terminology and just be rude. It takes a lot less effort and energy to say, nah, I'm good, and then you either hide your profile or block them and move on, or you do whatever you need to do to just move on to the next interaction. On the flip side, however, I have a message for my fellow feminine presenting gay men, and that is to go where you are wanted. I know sometimes for a lot of us feminine presenting gay men, we have that fantasy of wanting, our Mr. Right or Mr. Right now to be the masculine presenting guy. Or we have our trade fantasy. And again, there's nothing wrong necessarily inherently having that. But I think it's important to be mindful that, Mr. Right or Mr. Right now may not be the trade. It may not be the masculine presenting guy that is Masc4Masc and only wants another masculine presenting guy. Sometimes it's possible to find enjoyment in someone who has a little bit more latitude and freedom in how they express themselves, because you don't have to worry about the cloud of having to adhere to a bunch of gender norms hanging over your head in every single word, interaction, and embrace that you have, right? I would say that instead of trying to stick to keeping a relationship within the box or within the confines of a box, try to find someone that is more nuanced and is compatible to you. Find someone that has free energy and that has divested themselves of rigid gender-based systems. Try to find someone that is in alignment with what your goals are, whether it be professionally or dating wise for that. And don't waste years of your life trying to fix yourself and trying to change yourself to be wanted, because honestly, that those years of fixing and trying to change yourself often come at a high price, and often they end up coming in vain. There is an old saying that says that nature always wins, and that is also the truth when it comes to feminine presenting gay men. Your nature tends to win out, and so eventually you get to a place where you say, forget it, I'm going to do me. And lastly, invest in elevating to be the best version of your own self, because the best version of your own self is not going to be always a masculine presenting part of yourself, right? I know for myself, I thought the best version of myself was going to be a masculine presenting, ripped, muscly version of myself. And honestly, I'm still in the process of figuring out who that best version of myself is. But I don't think that me being a necessarily masculine person is going to make me a better version of myself, right? Because better is always going to be subjective. And so, with that being said, it was a pleasure to go through this essay with you and to talk through this topic. And please make sure that you share your thoughts in the comments. And if you like this discussion, please be sure to share it to your friends, your family, and distribute it worldwide. And again, it has been a pleasure to join you in another episode of Cutting the Strings, and I hope to see you in the next one. Have a happy holidays, and so long. Toodles, and bye-bye.